Daniel Carter slammed both palms flat on the conference table so hard that the water glasses shook. He leaned forward, his face inches from Emily's, and he spoke in a low, controlled voice that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "You think you deserve something? You built nothing. You are nothing. Sign the papers and disappear before I make sure every door in this industry closes permanently in your face." He straightened up, buttoned his jacket, and smiled at his lawyers like she wasn't even in the room anymore. Emily picked up the pen. Her hand was completely steady, and she signed away every single thing she owned, without one word, without one tear. That silence would cost Daniel Carter everything. Before we go any further, if this story already has you feeling something, please take a second right now to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The divorce papers were dated March the 14th. Emily Carter remembered that morning the way people remember the exact moment their life splits in two. Not by the date on the calendar, but by the feeling in their chest. Like something hollow had opened up. Like the floor had shifted slightly and never quite settled back into place. She had woken up at 5:30 that morning without an alarm. She lay in the guest bedroom of the house she had lived in for 11 years. A house that would, by the end of the day, no longer be hers in any legal sense. And she stared at the ceiling, and she breathed slowly, and she made a decision. She decided that she would not cry today. Not because she wasn't hurting. She was hurting in a way that doesn't have a proper word in the English language. 12 years. 12 years of her life. 12 years of early mornings and late nights, and believing in someone so completely that you forget to keep an eye on what that belief is actually costing you. But today was not a day for tears. Today was the first day of something else entirely. She dressed simply. A beige cardigan her mother had given her years ago. Flat shoes. No jewelry, except for the small watch her father had left her when he passed. She looked in the mirror, and she almost didn't recognize herself. Not because she looked bad, but because the woman looking back at her seemed so much calmer than she felt on the inside. Like the outside had already made peace with something the inside was still wrestling with. She drove herself to the courthouse. Not in the Tesla that technically belonged to the household. Not in the Range Rover that Daniel had bought for her 2 birthdays ago. She drove herself in the 2009 Honda Civic she'd kept in storage at her sister's house for years. The car she'd driven when she and Daniel were just starting out. When they were eating ramen noodles in a 1-bedroom apartment in Austin, and he was telling her every single night that one day, Emily, we're going to change the world. She had believed him. That was the part that still stung. She had believed every word of it. The conference room at Hargrove & Mills Legal Partners was on the 14th floor of a glass office building in downtown Dallas. When Emily stepped off the elevator, the first thing she noticed was the sound. Or rather, the lack of it. The kind of silence that rooms full of expensive lawyers tend to produce. People speaking in low voices, papers shuffling, the quiet hum of fluorescent lighting, and the distant muffled traffic 12 stories below. Daniel was already there. He was sitting at the head of the long conference table, the way he always sat in every room he ever entered. Like the table had been built specifically for him. Like the chair had been carved to fit his particular posture. Like the air in the room was there for his benefit. He was wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he was speaking to his lead attorney, a man named Marcus Webb, in the low, confident tone of someone who already knew how everything was going to end. He glanced up when Emily walked in. Something moved across his face. Not quite guilt, not quite regret. Something more like recognition. The way you look at a problem you've already solved. Emily sat down across from him. Her own attorney, a quiet, careful woman named Susan Doyle, sat beside her and immediately began spreading documents across the table in a precise, practiced way that Emily had always found oddly comforting. Susan was not a flashy lawyer. She didn't make speeches. She didn't perform. She simply knew the law better than most people in Dallas, and she was one of the very few people in Emily's life who had never once told her what to do. "Emily," Daniel said. It wasn't a greeting. It was something else. Something almost like a warning. "Daniel," Emily said simply. Just his name, nothing else. Marcus Webb cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" What followed was 45 minutes of legal language that essentially translated to one central, devastating truth. Emily Carter was signing away her claim to everything. The house, the investment accounts, the stock options in Carter Technologies, a company currently valued at $3.2 billion, the patent portfolio, the vacation properties, the company vehicle program. 12 years of shared financial history, all of it going one direction, all of it going Daniel. At one point, Marcus Webb paused and looked at Emily with what might have been genuine concern. "Mrs. Carter, I want to be certain you understand the scope of what you're relinquishing here. Your attorney has advised—" "She understands," Daniel interrupted. Emily looked at Marcus Webb calmly. "I understand completely." Susan Doyle put her hand lightly on Emily's arm. Just for a moment, just briefly. But Emily felt it, and she understood what it meant. It meant, "Are you sure?" It meant, "We can still stop this." It meant, "I will fight for you if you tell me to." Emily gave a single small nod, not to the room, just to Susan. And Susan slowly withdrew her hand and said nothing more. Daniel watched the exchange with visible satisfaction. He leaned back slightly in his chair, and there was something in his posture, a loosening, a settling, like a man who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has finally been allowed to put it down. "You know," he said, and his voice had that particular quality it got when he was performing for an audience, even a small one. "I want to say something, for the record." Nobody stopped him. "I spent a long time trying to figure out what went wrong between us, Emily, and I've come to the conclusion that some people just aren't built for this level of success. It's nothing personal. It's just compatibility. You were a great partner in the early days. You were. But somewhere along the line, you stopped growing, and I couldn't stay in something that was holding me back." The room was very quiet. Emily looked at him. She let him finish. She waited an extra beat, just to make sure he was done. Then she said, "Are the documents ready to sign?" Something flickered in Daniel's expression. It was brief, gone almost before it appeared. But Emily caught it. She was very good at catching the things Daniel thought he was hiding. It was confusion, genuine confusion. He had expected a reaction. He had needed one. That speech had been designed to produce something: anger, tears, some visible confirmation that he had the power to hurt her. And she had given him nothing. And that confused him in a way that, if Emily was being honest with herself, gave her a feeling she was not entirely proud of, but was not going to apologize for either. The documents were signed at 10:47 in the morning. When Emily walked out of the conference room, she did not look back. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby, and she watched the floor numbers count down, and she thought about her father, who had died 2 years ago, and who had told her once, in the last few months of his life, that the most powerful thing a person can do when someone underestimates them is to let them keep doing it. She thought she finally understood what he meant. The lobby of the building was full of the ordinary bustle of a Tuesday morning in Dallas. People coming in, people going out, phones ringing, coffee cups in hands. Nobody looked at the woman in the beige cardigan who walked through the glass doors and stood on the sidewalk, and tilted her face very slightly upward toward the March sky and took a long, slow breath. Nobody knew her name. Nobody noticed her at all. That was exactly as she intended it. She drove her 2009 Honda Civic to a storage unit on the east side of Dallas. The unit was registered not in her name, but in the name of a small LLC she had formed 3 years ago, quietly, on the advice of the one person outside of Susan Doyle who knew what Emily had been preparing for. She unlocked the unit and pulled up the metal door and stood there for a moment looking at the contents. 4 fireproof filing cabinets, 2 hard drives in a sealed case, a portable scanner, and 17 clearly labeled folders organized in a color-coded system that had taken her months to perfect. This was the collection. This was the thing Daniel Carter had no idea existed. For the last 3 years, Emily had been quietly, methodically, carefully building a record. Every suspicious transfer she noticed when she inadvertently had access to joint financial statements. Every conversation she overheard. Every document that crossed her path in the early years, when Daniel still trusted her enough to let her handle parts of the business. The engineers who would come to her quietly, outside of official channels, confused and afraid, saying things like, "Emily, I think they registered my work under someone else's name," and "I don't know who else to tell this to." She had listened to every one of them. She had kept records. She had followed threads. She hadn't known, at the start, exactly what she would find. She had not expected it to be this large. She pulled one of the labeled folders from the cabinet and sat down on the concrete floor of the storage unit, not because there was nowhere else to sit, but because she had sat on this particular floor many times over the past 3 years, and it had become, in a strange way, a thinking place for her. And she opened the folder and looked at the contents, and she felt the same thing she always felt when she reviewed this material. Not satisfaction, exactly, not even anger anymore, though anger had certainly been part of it in the beginning. Something closer to clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you have looked at something long and hard enough that all the emotional noise around it falls away, and you can finally see it for exactly what it is. She picked up her phone and sent a text message to a number that was saved in her contacts simply as V. It said, "It's done. Meeting tomorrow?" The reply came back in less than a minute. "My office, 8 a.m. Bring everything." She put the phone down. She looked at the ceiling of the storage unit, and for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself the smallest, quietest smile. Victor Langford was 71 years old and had made his first $10 million before he was 30, and his first billion before he was 50, and had spent the years since then doing largely whatever he wanted, which mostly meant investing in companies he found interesting, refusing interviews, living on a 40-acre ranch outside of Santa Fe, and occasionally, when the situation genuinely warranted it, deciding to correct an injustice that the official systems were moving too slowly to address on their own. Emily had met him 4 years ago at a technology conference in San Francisco. She had not gone to meet him specifically. She had gone because she still believed, at that point, in the company she and Daniel had built, and she went to industry events to stay connected to that world. Victor had been a keynote speaker. She had listened to him talk for 40 minutes about the ethics of intellectual property and the ways that large corporations systematically stripped individual inventors of credit and compensation. And she had sat in her chair in the 4th row and felt a cold recognition move through her like ice water. She had found him afterward at the reception. She had introduced herself, and she had watched his face carefully when she gave her last name, and she had seen him recognize it, and she had seen the way he very carefully did not react. "Carter Technologies," he said, nodding. "Remarkable company." "It is," Emily said. "I helped build it." Something shifted in Victor's expression. Not dramatically, just slightly. Just enough. I know, he said quietly. That had been the beginning. Their conversations over the following months were always conducted carefully. Phone calls from landlines. Meetings in places neither of them was known. Victor had connections that Emily didn't. Former government colleagues, legal experts who specialized in corporate fraud, forensic accountants who had worked on some of the largest financial investigations in American history. He brought those connections to what Emily had already built, and the picture that emerged was bigger than either of them had initially understood. Daniel didn't just steal from engineers, Victor told her once, during a meeting in a hotel conference room in Phoenix that neither of them had any visible reason to be in. He stole from everyone who trusted him, including me. He paused. I introduced him to his first major investor. I vouched for him personally. Whatever he built, I helped give him the platform to build it. Another pause. That makes this personal. Emily had looked at him and said, "Good. Personal is what we need." Now, on the afternoon of the day she signed the divorce papers with nothing, she sat in her storage unit on the concrete floor, and she reviewed the timeline one more time. 6 months. That was what the legal team had said they needed. 6 months to gather the final pieces, to approach the remaining witnesses, to coordinate with the federal contact who had been quietly tracking Carter Technologies for the better part of 2 years, but needed corroborating documentation from inside the company structure. 6 months. She could do 6 months. She had already done 3 years. She closed the folder and stood up and dusted off the back of her jeans, and she thought, not for the first time, about the look on Daniel's face in that conference room when she had not reacted to his speech. The confusion in his eyes. The brief, involuntary flicker of something that was not quite the confidence he always wore like a second skin. She filed it away. She locked the storage unit. She got back in her car. And she drove away from that particular chapter of her life without looking in the rear-view mirror even once. The weeks that followed were both the loneliest and the most focused of Emily Carter's adult life. She had moved into a small, furnished apartment in a quiet neighborhood on the north side of Dallas. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with a window that looked out onto a parking lot. By any external measure, it was a significant step down from the 7,000-square-foot house in Highland Park that was now entirely Daniel's. She did not find it depressing. She found it clarifying. There is something about a small, undecorated space that forces you to understand exactly what you actually need and what you have simply been surrounding yourself with out of habit. She bought a coffee maker and a good mattress and a standing desk and a reliable internet connection. And she set up one of the hard drives from the storage unit, and she went to work. The first major development came 5 weeks after the divorce signing. His name was Trevor Olson. He was 34 years old and had been a senior software engineer at Carter Technologies from the company's 3rd year of operation. He had left the company under what the official record described as mutually agreed separation terms, but what actually amounted to a forced departure after he had quietly raised concerns with the legal department about the attribution of a patents portfolio. He had been presented with a non-disclosure agreement and a severance payment, and had been told, in terms that left no real room for interpretation, that his career in the industry would be considerably smoother if he signed and stayed quiet. He had signed. He had stayed quiet. For 6 years. Then he got an email from a legal firm he'd never heard of, inviting him to speak confidentially with a consulting team that was conducting a financial review. The email included a detail, one very specific, technical detail about the patents in question that Trevor Olson had never shared with anyone, that he hadn't even written down, that he had carried around in his head for 6 years like a splinter he couldn't reach. He called the number in the email within 2 hours of receiving it. Emily was in the room when Susan Doyle made that call. She didn't speak. She sat at the other end of the conference table, and she listened to Trevor Olson's voice through the speakerphone. And she heard the way it changed, the way it started tight and careful and guarded, and then gradually, as the conversation progressed, loosened into something that sounded almost like relief. The relief of a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and had finally been given permission to put it down. "There were 8 of us," Trevor said. 8 engineers who had IP claims that went nowhere. We talked about it amongst ourselves, privately. We knew what had happened. We all had families. We all had mortgages. We all signed the NDAs. A long pause. "Can I ask who I'm actually talking to here? Who's behind this review?" Susan Doyle glanced at Emily. Emily shook her head once. "Not yet." "What I can tell you," Susan said into the phone, "is that the person coordinating this effort has a direct and personal stake in seeing Carter Technologies held accountable. And that this is not a fishing expedition. We have documentation. We need your testimony to corroborate what we already know." Another silence on the line. Then Trevor Olson said, in a voice that was very quiet but very certain, "Tell me what you need." Emily closed her eyes briefly. 8 engineers, and Trevor was going to help them find the rest. That night, she sat at her standing desk long after midnight, reading through technical documents she'd spent 3 years collecting. And she thought about Daniel in his 7,000-square-foot house and his billion-dollar company and his absolute rock-solid certainty that he had already won, that the story was over, that she was gone, that she was, as he had always privately believed, not a serious threat to anything he had built. She thought about his laugh in that conference room. She thought about the word nothing. And she went back to work. Trevor Olson was not a man who cried easily. He had grown up in rural Oklahoma with a father who believed that emotional restraint was a form of strength, and he had carried that belief through engineering school and through the early brutal years of working 80-hour weeks at startups that burned bright and collapsed fast, and through the specific and particular devastation of watching his best work get erased from the record as though he had never existed. He had not cried when he signed the NDA. He had not cried when he cleaned out his desk at Carter Technologies. He had not cried at any point in the 6 years that followed. But when Susan Doyle's voice came through his phone speaker and recited back to him, word for word, a technical specification that he had written by hand in a notebook that he had then burned in his backyard fireplace because he was that afraid, something cracked open in his chest that he did not immediately know how to close. He sat in his car in the parking lot of a grocery store in Austin, Texas, and he pressed his fist against his mouth, and he breathed very carefully for about 30 seconds. Then he said, "I'm in. Whatever you need, I'm in." Emily heard those words and felt something move through her that she would not have been able to name precisely. It was not triumph. It was too early for triumph, and she was too careful a person to let herself feel anything that premature. It was something quieter than that, something closer to the feeling of watching a foundation begin to hold weight for the first time and understanding, on a deep and structural level, that the building you have been constructing in secret is actually going to stand. She looked across the conference table at Susan Doyle, who was making notes in the small, precise handwriting that Emily had come to associate with forward motion. "We need the others," Emily said, after the call ended. Susan looked up. "Trevor thinks he can reach at least 4 of the 8 directly. The other 3 are harder. 2 of them relocated out of state. One of them, a woman named Diane Park, apparently changed careers entirely, left the tech industry." "Find her anyway," Emily said. Susan didn't argue. She never argued. She simply wrote the name down. That was week 5, and by week 7, the velocity of what Emily had set in motion began to accelerate in ways she had anticipated intellectually, but had not quite braced for emotionally. Because collecting evidence in a storage unit on the east side of Dallas, in the quiet and the solitude of a project only a handful of people knew about, is one kind of experience. Watching that evidence begin to move through real legal channels, watching real people attach their real names to real statements that could alter the course of their lives permanently, that is a different thing entirely. That has weight. That has consequence. And Emily Carter, who had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, found herself lying awake at 3 in the morning on more than one occasion, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, asking herself the question she had been asking herself since the very beginning. Are you sure? Not about Daniel. She was absolutely sure about Daniel. But about the people whose lives would be disrupted by what was coming. The employees at Carter Technologies, who had nothing to do with the fraud and would watch their stock options evaporate. The investors who had trusted the wrong man. The collateral damage that attaches itself to every large-scale financial unraveling, indiscriminate and heavy, falling on the guilty and the innocent with equal force. She was sure. She was just not comfortable. And she had decided, somewhere along the way, that being uncomfortable with the weight of what she was doing was not a reason to stop. It was, in fact, the appropriate response. The moment she stopped feeling the weight of it was the moment she should start worrying about who she was becoming. The 8th week brought the first real test. Victor Langford called her on a Tuesday afternoon. Not a text, a call. Victor almost never called. He preferred written communication, which left records, which was itself a kind of discipline. The habit of a man who had learned early that accountability moves in both directions. "We have a problem," he said. Emily set down her coffee. "Tell me." "One of my people, the forensic accountant I brought in, a man named Howard Chen. He was approached yesterday. Not officially, informally. Someone reached out to a mutual professional contact and suggested, casually, that Howard might want to consider stepping back from any projects that could put him in conflict with Carter Technologies." A pause. The language was careful, nothing overtly threatening. But Howard has been in this business for 30 years, and he understood what was being communicated. Emily was quiet for a moment. "Does Daniel know?" "Not specifically, but someone knows something is moving, which means somewhere in the chain there's a leak. Or, at minimum, a very attentive observer." "How is Howard?" "Rattled," Victor said, "but committed. He's not backing down. He wants me to tell you that directly. He's not backing down." Emily exhaled slowly. "Okay. We accelerate the timeline on the financial documentation. Anything Howard hasn't formally logged yet, we prioritize getting it into the protected record this week. If they're watching, they're going to watch us move faster." Victor was quiet for a second. "You're not scared." "I didn't say that. You're handling this like someone who isn't scared." "I'm handling this like someone who knows that scared and stopped are not the same thing," Emily said. "There's a difference." Another pause. Then Victor said, quietly, "Daniel Carter is going to be very sorry he underestimated you." "Yes," Emily said. "He is." She hung up and sat very still for a moment. Then she called Susan Doyle. The acceleration changed the texture of the following weeks in ways both practical and psychological. There was less sleep. There were more calls. There were days when Emily moved through her small apartment from the standing desk to the kitchen to the couch and back again without ever really stopping, processing documents, reviewing testimony, responding to the stream of secure messages that flowed between her and Susan and Victor, and the expanding team of people who were, carefully and deliberately, helping to build the case. She ate when she remembered to eat. She slept when her body simply refused to continue without it, and she moved forward. Week 10 brought Diane Park. Trevor Olson had found her, Not through any of the official channels, but through a former colleague who knew someone who knew her sister. Diane Park was 39 years old and was now running a small pottery studio in Asheville, North Carolina. She had not spoken publicly about Carter Technologies in any form since the day she left. She had, according to Trevor, built an entirely new life with what appeared to be considerable deliberateness. The kind of deliberateness that belongs to someone who needed to put as much distance as possible between themselves and a specific chapter of their history. She agreed to a video call. Emily was on it. When Diane's face appeared on the screen, the first thing Emily noticed was the wariness, the careful, measured quality of someone who has learned to assess threats quickly and quietly. Diane looked at Emily for a long moment before she spoke. "You were his wife," she said. It was not an accusation, it was an observation, but it contained a question inside it. "I was," Emily said. "And you're the one running this." "Yes." Diane was quiet. She looked away from the screen for a moment, then back. "I left because of what they did to my patent. 4 years of work. I filed the original documentation. I have the timestamps. And then one day I'm sitting in a meeting, and Marcus Webb is presenting the same technology to investors, and my name is nowhere on it. And when I raised it, Daniel looked me straight in the face and told me I was confused about the timeline." She said it flatly, without drama, the way people describe old wounds that have closed over but not disappeared. "He told me I was confused, in front of 8 people." "I know," Emily said. "How do you know?" Emily looked at her steadily. "Because I was in the building when it happened. And I heard the conversation afterward. The one between Daniel and Marcus Webb, where they discussed how to manage you. A beat. I kept notes." The silence on the other end of the call stretched for 5 full seconds. Then Diane Park said, "You kept notes." "I kept notes," Emily said. "I kept a lot of notes." What happened in Diane Park's expression in that moment was something Emily would think about for a long time afterward. Because it was not simply anger, though there was anger in it. And it was not simply relief, though there was relief in it too. It was the specific and profound expression of someone who has spent years carrying the weight of being told that their version of events was wrong, their memory was faulty, their perception was distorted, and who is now, for the first time, being handed proof that they were right all along. That they had always been right. That the problem was never their confusion. The problem was someone else's deliberate and calculated lie. Diane Park leaned forward toward the camera. "Tell me what you need from me." By week 12, the legal team had formal statements from 6 of the 8 engineers. Howard Chen had completed the primary financial documentation and delivered it, in encrypted format, to both Susan Doyle and the federal contact who had been quietly working the case from his end. His name was Agent Marcus Reyes, and he had been with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division for 14 years. And when Victor Langford had first connected him to Emily 7 months earlier, he had looked at the documentation she provided and gone very still, in the way that experienced investigators go still when they recognize something significant. "This is a significant case," he had said to Victor afterward. "This is a very significant case." Now, at week 12, Reyes called Emily directly for the first time. "We're ready to move," he said. "On our end, we have enough for a formal investigation to be reopened under federal jurisdiction. The financial irregularities alone are sufficient. But the IP documentation, the patents, that's going to be what breaks this open publicly. That's the part that's going to be impossible for him to explain away." Emily absorbed this. "What do you need from me?" "The original filing timestamps, the ones from the early development phase. We have copies, but we need the originals, or certified duplicates, to be formally entered." "I have them," Emily said. A pause on the line. "You have the original timestamps." "I have everything," Emily said, and she meant it in a way that was very literal and very specific, because Emily Carter had spent 3 years being meticulous, and she was not the kind of person who kept almost everything, or most things. She was the kind of person who kept everything. Reyes was quiet for a moment. "Miss Carter, in my 14 years doing this work, I have dealt with a lot of people who believed they had documentation that would change everything. And most of the time, the documentation is incomplete or inadmissible or circumstantial. But what you have assembled here..." He paused again. "I want to be professional about this, so I will simply say that it is comprehensive." Emily said, "I had a lot of time." She had meant it simply as a statement of fact, but after she hung up the phone, she sat with those words for a moment. I had a lot of time. 12 years of marriage. 12 years of watching and listening and slowly understanding the shape of the man she had trusted completely. 12 years of being told that her contributions were supporting, supplementary, secondary. 12 years of being the woman behind the CEO. The quiet one at the industry dinners. The one who slipped out early and went home and nobody particularly noticed. 12 years of being invisible. And she had used every single moment of that invisibility to see exactly what was happening right in front of everyone. The irony was almost beautiful. Almost. The final pivot came in week 15, and it came from a direction Emily had not anticipated. A journalist named Claire Whitmore, who wrote for a national financial publication and had covered Carter Technologies extensively over the previous 3 years, reached out to Susan Doyle through a mutual contact. She had been, she explained carefully, independently investigating what she described as anomalies in Carter Technologies' patent history. She had hit walls. She had been threatened once, obliquely, through a source who she believed was connected to Carter Technologies' communications team. She had kept going anyway, and she had arrived at conclusions that were, in her words, extremely close to something she suspected was already in motion somewhere. Susan brought this to Emily immediately. Emily thought about it for 24 hours. Then she said, "Not yet. She doesn't get the story until after the hearing. But tell her to keep her schedule clear in 6 weeks." Susan raised an eyebrow. "You're going to give her the exclusive?" "I'm going to give the truth to someone who's been working to find it honestly," Emily said. "That's different from giving someone an exclusive." Susan looked at her for a moment, then wrote it down. Week 16. Emily was sitting at her standing desk at 11 at night, working through the final organization of the document package that would be presented at the hearing, when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. The message was short. It said, "I know what you're doing. This is your last chance to walk away clean. Take it." She looked at the message for a long time. Then she screenshotted it, sent it to both Susan and Victor, and went back to work. The message was not reported to her as having come from Daniel directly. His fingerprints, in this as in everything, were carefully not visible. It had almost certainly come from someone connected to his legal team, or to the broader network of people who had, over the years, developed an interest in keeping Daniel Carter's particular version of reality intact. It didn't matter. The message told her 2 important things. First, that they were aware something was coming, and second, that they were afraid enough to reach out. Fear, in Emily's experience, was what happened when powerful people started to understand that the narrative was no longer entirely under their control. She did not respond to the message. She didn't need to. The response she was preparing was not going to come through a text. 3 days before the hearing, Emily met Victor Langford in person for the first time since the project had entered its final phase. They met at a private conference space in a building in Fort Worth, far enough from Dallas to be unremarkable, close enough to be practical. Victor was thinner than she remembered, the kind of thin that accumulates quietly in a person over the course of a very intense period of sustained effort. But his eyes were exactly as she remembered them. Clear, steady, carrying the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent decades learning how to see through what is presented to them, down to what is actually there. He looked at her for a long moment when she walked in. Then he said, "You look like someone who is ready." "I am ready," she said. "How do you feel?" She sat down across from him. She thought about the question honestly, the way she always tried to think about questions that deserved honest answers. "I feel like I've been carrying this for a very long time," she said. "And I feel like, in 3 days, I'm going to be able to put it down." A pause. "Not because it's over, because what comes after is going to be hard in its own way, but because the part that has been mine to carry alone is almost finished." Victor nodded slowly. "The jet is confirmed. Departure at 6:45. We land at the executive airport at 8:15. The hearing begins at 9. "The jet is necessary?" Emily asked, and there was something almost wry in her voice. Victor looked at her with an expression that was entirely straight-faced. "Emily, this man stood in a conference room and told you, in front of witnesses, that you are nothing. He laughed at you. He sent you a threat through an anonymous number 3 days ago, and he is currently sitting in his 7,000-square-foot house, completely convinced that tomorrow morning, a woman who once drove a 2009 Honda Civic to sign away her life is going to arrive at his final hearing, quietly, in something small and unremarkable, and he is going to close the book on her forever." He paused. "The jet is necessary." Emily looked at him, and for only the second time in the entire 6 months of what they had built together, she smiled. Not the small, controlled, internal smile she had allowed herself in the storage unit on the day she signed the papers. Something wider than that. Something that reached all the way to her eyes. "The jet is necessary," she agreed. They spent the next 4 hours going through the documents one final time. Every page, every timestamp, every statement, every transfer record, every patent filing. Every thread of the web that Daniel Carter had spent a decade and a half weaving, and that Emily Carter had spent 3 years learning to see from the outside, completely and clearly, the way you can only see the full shape of something when you are no longer standing at its center. When they finished, Victor gathered the papers together and looked up at her. "He's going to be in that courtroom tomorrow, believing he already won." "I know," Emily said. "And then you walk in." "And then I walk in," she said quietly. That night, back in her apartment, Emily laid out the charcoal suit she had bought 3 weeks earlier. Simple, clean, well-made. Not expensive in a way that was designed to be noticed. Expensive in the way that things are when they are built to last. She stood there looking at it for a moment, and she thought about the beige cardigan. She thought about the 2009 Honda Civic. She thought about the conference room and the water glasses shaking, and Daniel's voice, low and controlled and contemptuous, and the word nothing that he had said, as though it were a fact of nature rather than a choice he was making about how to see her. She thought about 12 years. She thought about 3 more. She thought about Trevor Olson crying quietly in a parking lot in Austin. About Diane Park leaning toward a camera in a pottery studio in Asheville. About Howard Chen staying at his desk after being threatened. About Agent Reyes going still in the specific way of a man who recognizes something that matters. About Susan Doyle's hand on her arm in the conference room, asking without words if she was sure. She thought about her father. Power is patient when it knows what it's building. She turned off the light. She slept. And 6 hours later, the wheels of a Gulfstream G650 lifted off the runway and turned toward Dallas. The Gulfstream touched down at Dallas Executive Airport at 8:17 in the morning, 3 minutes ahead of schedule, because Victor Langford had a long-standing policy of arriving early to everything that mattered, and a longer-standing policy of never apologizing for it. Emily felt the wheels connect with the runway, and she took one slow breath, and she did not look out the window. She had spent the 40-minute flight reviewing nothing, reading nothing. She had sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes forward, and she had let the previous 6 months settle inside her like sediment finding the bottom of still water. There was nothing left to review. There was nothing left to prepare. Everything that could be done had been done. What was left now was simply the act of walking through a door. Victor was across from her. He had spent the flight the same way, still contained, carrying the particular composure of a man who has seen enough large moments to know that anxiety before them accomplishes nothing useful. When the plane stopped, he looked at her. "How are you doing?" "Ask me in 2 hours," she said. He almost smiled. "Fair enough." The legal team was already assembled when the plane door opened. Susan Doyle was standing at the base of the stairs in a dark blue suit, with a leather document case in one hand and her phone in the other. And when Emily came down the steps, Susan looked at her the way a person looks at someone they have been fighting alongside for a very long time, with a kind of recognition that goes beyond words, that is made entirely of shared history and shared weight, and the particular bond that forms between people who have chosen, together, to do something very hard. "Reyes is already at the courthouse," Susan said, falling into step beside Emily. "His team took up position at 8 o'clock. Everything is in the record. Everything is filed. The documents are in the hands of the judge's clerk as of 7:52 this morning." Emily absorbed this without breaking stride. "Daniel's team?" "Arrived at 8:05. Marcus Webb, 2 junior associates, and a man none of us recognized. Reyes thinks he's a damage control consultant, which means someone on Daniel's side got nervous overnight." "Someone on Daniel's side has been nervous for 3 weeks, Emily said. "The text message." "Right, but this morning feels different. This morning they're in the building, and they don't know what's coming, and nervous is turning into something closer to afraid." Susan paused briefly. "Daniel himself arrived at 8:10, alone except for Webb. No additional security, no PR team. He still thinks this is a formality." Emily said nothing. She got into the car. The drive to the federal courthouse took 11 minutes. Emily spent those 11 minutes in a state she would later describe to the very small number of people she discussed it with as a kind of controlled stillness. Not calm exactly. More like the specific mental state that takes over when a person has moved beyond the point where feelings are useful and entered the territory where only precision matters. She had felt it once before in her life, on the night her father died, when she had been the one to make the calls and handle the logistics because someone had needed to, and she had understood that grief was something she would have to get to later. This was similar. The feelings were there. They were real, and they were significant, and they would need space eventually. But not yet. Not for the next 2 hours. At 8:31, the car pulled up to the courthouse. Emily stepped out, and the first thing she heard, before she saw anything, before she processed the people on the steps or the cameras, because there were cameras now, 2 of them, held by people she did not recognize, which meant someone had tipped the press. The first thing she heard was her own name. Said not loudly, not dramatically, but in a tone of complete and total disbelief. A man's voice. One of Daniel's junior associates, standing near the entrance, who had clearly been sent out to watch for her arrival, and who had clearly been told to watch for a woman in something small and unremarkable, something quiet and defeated, something that matched the story Daniel had been telling about her for 6 months. He was looking at the car. He was looking at the people who had stepped out of it. He was looking at Victor Langford, who in certain financial circles required no introduction. He was looking at the legal team. And then he was looking at Emily, and whatever he had been expecting was so different from what he was seeing that for a full 3 seconds, he appeared to have forgotten what he was supposed to do next. Then he turned and went back inside, very quickly. Susan leaned slightly toward Emily and said quietly, "That's going to be a very interesting phone call to Marcus Webb in about 45 seconds." "Let's not give them 45 seconds," Emily said. They went inside. The federal courtroom was large and high-ceilinged and carried the particular gravity of rooms where consequential things happen regularly. The kind of room that has absorbed decades of significant decisions and holds them in its walls like accumulated weight. Emily had been in this building before, twice, for procedural hearings related to the divorce. But she had never been in this particular courtroom, and she noticed, as she walked in, the way the room's atmosphere hit her differently than she had expected. Not intimidating, something closer to appropriate, like a space that had been designed to hold exactly the kind of truth she was carrying. Daniel was already seated at the plaintiff's table. He heard the doors open. He did not turn immediately. People at Daniel Carter's level of professional confidence had learned to manage their reactions carefully in public settings, and the small performance of not turning immediately when someone entered a room was one of the habits that came with that management. He finished whatever he was saying to Marcus Webb first. Then he turned. And Emily watched, from a distance of perhaps 20 feet, as his face changed. It did not collapse. Daniel Carter's face was not built for collapse. It was built for control. And control was what it defaulted to even now, even in this moment when everything the past 6 months had told him was being contradicted by the physical reality in front of him. But the control was visible. That was the difference. It was something he was doing rather than something he simply was. And the effort of it showed in the slight tightening around his jaw and the very brief, very involuntary widening of his eyes before he pulled them back to neutral. He saw Victor Langford. That was the moment. That was the specific moment when Emily saw Daniel Carter understand, for the first time, that something was wrong. Not inconveniently wrong. Not manageable wrong. Wrong in a way that had weight to it, because Victor Langford did not come to divorce hearings. Victor Langford did not come to anything that was merely routine. Victor Langford's presence in a room meant the room contained something that Victor considered worth his personal attention. And Daniel knew Victor well enough to know that Victor's personal attention was not something you wanted directed at you in a federal courtroom. Marcus Webb had seen it too. He was already leaning toward Daniel, speaking in a low, rapid voice. Daniel cut him off with one word. Emily couldn't hear it from where she stood, but she could read the shape of it. And Marcus went quiet. Emily walked to her table. She did not look at Daniel again as she sat down. Susan placed the document case on the table between them and opened it with the same precise, practiced calm that Emily had always found steadying. Across the room, Emily could hear the low, urgent murmur of Daniel and Marcus Webb in close consultation. And she was aware of it the way you were aware of weather changing, registering it without giving it your direct attention. Victor took a seat in the gallery, second row, directly behind Emily's table. Agent Reyes and his colleague from Financial Crimes took seats in the gallery as well, on the opposite side, close to the door. They were not in uniform. They were not making any visible display. They were simply there, present, watching. 2 more threads of the web that Emily had spent 6 months weaving, now sitting quietly in a federal courtroom, waiting for the moment they would be needed. The judge entered at 9:03. Her name was the Honorable Patricia Waverly. She was 61 years old, and she had been on the federal bench for 16 years. And she had the specific quality of authority that is not performed, but simply inhabited. The kind that has nothing to prove, and therefore doesn't try. She settled into her seat, looked at her docket, looked at the room, and began. "We are here for the final resolution hearing in Carter versus Carter, I understand both parties are present and representation is in place. She glanced up. Mr. Webb. Marcus Webb rose. Your Honor, the plaintiff is prepared to finalize the terms of the settlement as previously. Your Honor. Susan Doyle's voice was clear and perfectly steady. She rose at the same time, and there was nothing aggressive in her tone, nothing dramatic. Just the measured confidence of a woman who knows exactly what she is about to place on the table. Before the settlement is finalized, the respondent wishes to submit supplementary documentation for the court's review, documentation that is materially relevant to the assets under consideration in this proceeding. The room went very still. Marcus Webb turned to look at Susan, with the expression of a man who has just heard a sound he cannot immediately identify. Your Honor, the settlement terms were agreed upon by both parties, and there is no basis for. The court will hear the respondent, Judge Waverly said simply. Not loudly. Simply. In the tone of someone who has seen enough attempted procedural maneuvers to be entirely unmoved by them. Susan opened the document case. She removed a precisely organized stack of documents, walked forward, and placed them on the judge's desk. Emily heard, in the 2 seconds of silence that followed, the sound of Marcus Webb pulling in a breath through his nose. Short, sharp, involuntary. The sound of a man whose professional composure is encountering something unexpected. Judge Waverly looked at the documents. She did not read them immediately. She looked at the first page with the expression of a person taking the measure of a weight before deciding how to lift it. Then she looked up. Ms. Doyle, can you characterize the nature of this documentation for the record? Yes, Your Honor. Susan's voice did not change in cadence or volume. The documentation consists of 4 categories. First, forensic financial analysis of offshore accounts connected to Carter Technologies, documenting approximately $340 million in assets not disclosed during the divorce proceedings. Second, records of insider trading activity conducted through venture capital structures affiliated with the plaintiff. Third, original patent filing records for 17 technologies currently held under Carter Technologies' portfolio, demonstrating prior development and authorship by individuals whose names were subsequently removed from the filings. And fourth, sworn statements from 6 former employees of Carter Technologies corroborating the above. The room was completely silent. Daniel Carter did not move. Then Marcus Webb was on his feet. Your Honor, this is procedurally improper. This material was not submitted through the appropriate discovery channels. It has not been subject to review. It has not. Mr. Webb. Judge Waverly's voice had not changed in volume. It had simply become more final. Sit down. He sat down. The judge looked at the documents again. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. The silence in the room was the specific kind that happens when everyone present understands that the axis of something has shifted, and nobody yet knows how far. Emily sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her, and she breathed slowly, and she did not look at Daniel. Not because she was afraid to, because looking at him was simply not relevant to anything that needed to happen in the next few minutes. Then Judge Waverly looked up. In light of the documentation submitted, this hearing is suspended pending review of the materials. She turned to look directly at the gallery, at Agent Reyes, at the financial crimes colleague beside him, not as though she was surprised to see them, as though she had understood from the moment she looked at the first page of those documents that their presence was not coincidental. I will be contacting the relevant federal authorities to determine the appropriate coordination between these proceedings and any concurrent federal investigation. Reyes gave a single, small nod. Daniel made a sound, not a word, something involuntary, something small. The sound of a man who has just felt the ground shift under him in a way that is real and structural and not recoverable by any of the tools he has spent his entire career accumulating. Marcus Webb leaned toward him immediately, speaking fast and low. And Daniel turned to him and said something, and Marcus shook his head once, sharply, and said something back, and Daniel looked forward again. And Emily, who had spent 12 years in close proximity to Daniel Carter's face and knew every register of its expressions, saw something she had never once seen there in all that time. Raw, unmanaged, genuine fear. Not the performed version. Not the controlled presentation of a man strategically choosing vulnerability. The real thing. The kind that moves through a person's expression before they have the chance to stop it. The kind that tells you that somewhere beneath all the construction, the suits and the confidence and the courtroom preparation and the billion-dollar company and the practiced contempt, there is still a human nervous system that understands, on the most fundamental level, when it is trapped. Susan Doyle sat back down beside Emily and said nothing. She did not need to say anything. She folded her hands on the table in front of her, and she waited for the judge to complete her administrative instructions to the clerk. And she was, in that moment, the steadiest person in the room. Behind Emily, from the second row of the gallery, Victor Langford leaned forward slightly. He said nothing either. He simply put one hand briefly on the back of Emily's chair. Not touching her, just there. The gesture of someone marking a moment. Emily registered it. She kept her eyes forward. The judge gave additional instructions to the clerk. She set a date for the reconvened hearing. She addressed both legal teams with the formal language of judicial procedure that transformed what had just happened from a human drama into an entry in a court record, which was exactly what it needed to become. And then she rose. And the room rose with her, and she left. And the moment the door to the judge's chambers closed, the room fell apart. Marcus Webb was on his phone before he had fully pushed back his chair, talking in a low, rapid, controlled voice that was fighting hard to stay controlled. Two of the federal team from Reyes's side moved toward the front of the room. One of Daniel's junior associates left through the side door at nearly a run. Someone in the gallery behind Emily started speaking. A journalist, she realized. The one she had not yet seen. The one who had clearly been tipped off that something was going to happen this morning and had arranged to be present for it. Daniel stood. He stood at his table, and he did not move for a moment. And then he turned. And he looked at Emily directly for the first time since she had walked into the room. She had thought about this moment. She had thought about it many times over the previous 6 months. She had imagined it and prepared herself for it, and decided, with careful deliberateness, how she wanted to handle it. She had decided she would not perform for it. She would not give him a speech. She would not give him the satisfaction of visible triumph or the comfort of visible anger. She would give him the truth, simply and without decoration. The same way she had always given him things, in the early years, before she understood that he had never been able to see what she gave him clearly. She looked back at him. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she said, quietly, in a voice that only he was close enough to hear, "I built everything. You just had my name removed from it." Daniel Carter said nothing. His mouth opened slightly, and then it closed. And for the first time in 12 years of knowing him, Emily Carter watched Daniel Carter fail to find a single word. She picked up her document case. She stood. She walked out of the courtroom. And in the hallway, Susan Doyle was already on her phone, coordinating the next stage, and Victor Langford was standing with his hands in his pockets, looking at her with the expression of a man who has watched a great many things in his 71 years and knows when he is watching something that matters. And Agent Reyes was moving toward her from the left, with purpose in his stride. And the journalist, whose name Emily did not yet know, was coming from the right with a recorder in her hand and questions she had been waiting weeks to ask. And the morning light was coming through the tall courthouse windows, and Emily Carter stood in the center of all of it, perfectly still, and breathed. She had 6 months ago walked out of a conference room wearing a beige cardigan, having signed away everything she owned. And Daniel Carter had laughed, and the word nothing had hung in the air behind her like a verdict. She had carried that word for 6 months. She was done carrying it. Marcus Webb came through the courtroom doors behind her at that moment and stopped when he saw the assembled group in the hallway. And the expression on his face cycled through several things very quickly, before settling into something professional and controlled that was doing considerable work to hide everything underneath it. He looked at Emily. He opened his mouth. Emily looked at him very calmly and said, "You should go back in there and advise your client to cooperate fully with the federal investigation. Whatever he does in the next 72 hours is going to determine how the rest of this goes for him. You know that. I suspect you've known it for longer than this morning." Something moved across Marcus Webb's face. Not agreement, not quite, but recognition. The recognition of a very good lawyer who understands when the other side has done something he cannot counter, and who is already, on some professional level, recalibrating everything he thought he knew about the case he was standing in. He said nothing. He went back through the courtroom doors. Reyes reached Emily's side. "We're going to need the originals of the patent timestamps this afternoon, if you can make that happen." "They're already at Susan's office," Emily said. "Call her." Reyes nodded. He started to turn, then stopped. He looked at her with the expression of someone who doesn't usually editorialize and is making a deliberate exception. "Ms. Carter, what you put together, the documentation, the timeline, the witnesses. In 14 years, I have not seen a private citizen construct something of that quality." He paused. "That's all I'm going to say about it." "Thank you, Marcus," she said. He went. Victor came to stand beside her. He said nothing for a moment, which was one of the things Emily had always appreciated about him. He understood the difference between moments that needed words and moments that needed to simply be inhabited. Then he said, "Breakfast?" Emily looked at him, and something released, somewhere deep in her chest, something she had been holding tightly for a very long time. And she laughed. Not a large laugh, not a performance, just the real, unguarded, slightly startled laugh of someone who has been operating at maximum intensity for 6 months and has just been offered the extremely ordinary option of breakfast. "Yes," she said. "Breakfast." The restaurant Victor chose was a quiet place 2 blocks from the courthouse, the kind that opened early and kept its booths private and did not have televisions mounted on the walls playing cable news. Emily was grateful for all 3 of those qualities, because cable news was already running with something. Susan had seen it on her phone before they'd even reached the car. A brief, breathless segment on a financial network. Nothing detailed yet. Just the words "federal hearing" and "Carter Technologies," and the kind of headline language that meant someone in or near that courtroom had made a call within minutes of the judge leaving the bench. The story was moving. Emily ordered black coffee and eggs she knew she wasn't going to finish, and she sat across from Victor in the corner booth. And she let herself, for the first time in 6 months, be somewhere that wasn't forward motion. Just for an hour. Just long enough to eat and breathe and let the morning settle into something she could actually hold. Victor was watching her the way he always watched people. Not intrusively, not with the performing quality of someone who wants to be seen watching, but with the quiet, patient attention of someone genuinely interested in what a person does when the pressure eases slightly. "You're waiting for the other shoe," he said. Emily looked up from her coffee. "I'm always waiting for the other shoe." "That's what happens when you spend 3 years expecting everything to go wrong." "Everything could still go wrong," she said. Not with anxiety, with precision. The federal investigation has to hold. The patent reversal has to survive Daniel's legal team's appeals. 6 witnesses have to stay solid under pressure. That's a lot of variables. "It is," Victor agreed, "and every one of them is in better shape than it was yesterday. Because yesterday, they were supporting a private action. Today, they're part of a federal record. He picked up his coffee cup. The documents are in the court record now, Emily. Marcus Webb cannot make them disappear. Daniel cannot pressure them out of existence. They exist in a system that is considerably more resistant to his particular methods than any system he has encountered before. Emily thought about that. She thought about the way Daniel had looked at her in the courtroom, the specific quality of fear she had seen moving through him. And she thought about what it meant for a man who had spent his entire professional life understanding exactly how much his power could accomplish, to encounter for the first time a situation where it could accomplish nothing at all. She thought it probably felt the way being underwater felt, like reaching for something solid and finding only more water. "He's going to fight," she said. "Of course he is. He's going to throw everything at the appeals. He's going to try to discredit the witnesses. He's going to have his communications team build a narrative that frames this as a vindictive ex-wife and a disgruntled former mentor and a conspiracy by people with personal grievances." She paused. "He's already building it. I guarantee you Marcus Webb made that call from the courthouse hallway." Victor nodded once. "He did. I have a contact at Carter Technologies' PR firm. She texted me 12 minutes ago. They've been activated." He met Emily's eyes. "Are you surprised?" "No," Emily said. "But I want to know what the narrative is." Victor's phone was already on the table. He turned it toward her. There was a text from an unsaved number, 3 lines long. "Official line being prepared. Angle is harassment, personal vendetta. Unstable former spouse coordinating with known adversaries of the company. Langford framed as predatory investor attempting hostile action. Documents characterized as fabricated." Emily read it twice. Then she set the phone back down. "Fabricated," she said. "That's the word they're using." She thought about the 17 filing cabinet folders, the original timestamps, the sworn statements from 6 engineers, Howard Chen's forensic accounting. 3 years of meticulous, organized, cross-referenced documentation. The word fabricated landed against all of that like a paper ball thrown at a wall of concrete. She almost felt something like gratitude for it, because fabricated was a claim that could be tested, and tested evidence, when it was real, did not fabricate itself back out of existence. "They're going to find out very quickly," she said, "that calling something fabricated in a federal proceeding requires you to then explain, in detail, why it's fabricated. And that is going to be a very long and very uncomfortable explanation." Victor picked up his coffee again. "Yes," he said simply. "It is." Susan called at 9:58, while Emily was still at the table. Her voice was moving fast, the way it moved when things were accelerating, and she was tracking multiple threads simultaneously. "Reyes has the originals. His team is processing them now. The court clerk has entered a formal hold on all Carter Technologies assets, pending the federal review. That happened 40 minutes ago, which means Daniel can't move money," Emily said. "Which means Daniel cannot move anything," Susan confirmed. "Accounts frozen. Asset transfers blocked. The board of Carter Technologies is being notified as we speak." A brief pause. "Emily, the stock started moving at 9:45. It's down 11% in the first hour of trading." The table was quiet for a moment. 11% in 1 hour. That was not a normal market fluctuation. That was the specific and unmistakable movement of institutional investors reading between the lines of very thin public information and deciding they did not want to be holding a position they couldn't explain when more information became available. That was smart money making a fast, quiet, early exit. That was the first physical evidence, in numbers on a screen, of what was happening to the empire Daniel Carter had built. "Keep me updated," Emily said. Every 30 minutes, Susan said, and hung up. Victor had heard enough from Emily's side to understand. He looked at her steadily. 11%. In the first hour. He set down his coffee cup very carefully. By the time the market closes today, that number is going to be considerably larger. Emily nodded. She looked at her eggs, which she had not touched. Then she picked up her fork, because she had not eaten since 5 that morning, and she was going to need to function for the rest of the day. And she ate, slowly and deliberately, while the story she had spent 3 years building moved through the world at a velocity she could no longer entirely control or predict. That was the nature of truth, she had learned. Once you released it, it moved on its own terms. You could shape the conditions under which it emerged. You could prepare the ground carefully. You could build the record and protect the witnesses and coordinate the timing. But the actual movement, the way it spread and grew and collided with things you hadn't anticipated, that was out of your hands. She had made her peace with that. At 11:15, the journalist found her. Not Claire Whitmore, the one Emily had promised the exclusive. A different one, a man named Paul Garrett from a Dallas daily who had clearly been working his sources since the courthouse that morning and had tracked her to the general vicinity through means Emily would have preferred he hadn't managed quite so quickly. He approached her on the sidewalk outside the restaurant as she and Victor were leaving. He was mid-30s, slightly out of breath, carrying a recorder he hadn't yet raised, which Emily interpreted as a reasonable instinct on his part. "Ms. Carter," he said. "Paul Garrett, Dallas Morning. Can I ask you a few questions about this morning's hearing?" Emily looked at him. She took in the recorder at his side, the slightly disheveled energy of someone who had been moving fast since early morning. The genuine alertness in his eyes that distinguished a real journalist from a performed one. "You can ask," she said. "I'm not going to give you much, but you can ask." He raised the recorder. "The documents submitted this morning at the Carter hearing, are they connected to a federal investigation into Carter Technologies?" "That's a question for the federal authorities," Emily said. "Were you aware, when you agreed to the original divorce settlement terms, of the financial discrepancies now alleged in those documents?" She looked at him for a moment. "I was aware," she said carefully, "that the settlement I signed in March did not reflect the full picture of the marital assets. The documentation submitted this morning speaks to the specifics. Is it accurate to characterize what happened today as a reversal of the original settlement? It's accurate to characterize what happened today as the beginning of a process," she said. "The settlement was signed 6 months ago. What was submitted to the court this morning is the result of 6 months of work. What happens next is up to the court and the federal process." Garrett was writing quickly. "Daniel Carter's team is characterizing the documents as fabricated and the action as—" "I know what Daniel Carter's team is characterizing it as," Emily said, without heat. "And I'd encourage you, and every other journalist covering this story, to look very carefully at the actual documentation before you report that characterization as anything other than a legal defense position. Because the documents speak for themselves. They have always spoken for themselves. It just took the right forum to make them audible." Garrett lowered his recorder slightly. He looked at her with the expression of someone processing something that's better than what he expected. "Ms. Carter, one more question. 6 months ago, you left that courthouse with nothing. Was that part of this? Did you know when you signed those papers that this was going to happen?" The sidewalk was quiet around them. A passing car, the distant sound of the city going about its Tuesday. Emily stood in the September light and looked at Paul Garrett and thought about her father, and the storage unit, and Trevor Olson's voice on the phone, breaking open after 6 years, and Diane Park leaning toward a camera in Asheville, and the look on Daniel's face when he had no words left. "What I knew," she said quietly, "was that the truth existed. I knew where it was, and what it looked like, and what it would take to bring it into a space where it couldn't be dismissed. The rest was work." She paused. "Just work." She walked away. Victor fell into step beside her. After a moment, he said, "Just work." "Don't," she said. He almost smiled again. He was doing that more today than she had ever seen him do in 7 months of working together. It suited him. The afternoon unfolded with the relentless, accumulating velocity of something that has been held back for a long time and is now moving with the full force of that delay. At 12:40, the board of Carter Technologies released a statement saying they were aware of federal proceedings and were cooperating fully with all relevant authorities. This was, in the specific language of corporate crisis communication, the equivalent of every board member individually placing as much distance as possible between themselves and the man whose name was on the building. Susan sent it to Emily with a single word appended: "Fast." Emily read it. She had expected board action. She had not expected it quite this fast, which told her something important about what the board had known or suspected for longer than this morning. Because boards did not move this quickly on incomplete information. They moved this quickly when incomplete information confirmed what they had already quietly been worrying about. At 1:53, Carter Technology stock closed the day down 23%. Susan called with a number. Emily was sitting at the small desk in Victor's temporary office space, working through the next stage of documentation with Howard Chen via video call. And when Susan's call came through, she put Howard briefly on hold and answered it. And Susan said, 23. And Emily said, understood, and returned to Howard Chen without elaborating, because Howard was aware of the stock situation and had been monitoring it, and there was nothing additional that needed to be said about it. Numbers spoke. This particular number was speaking very loudly. Howard Chen was 57 years old and had the specific quality of steadiness that forensic accountants who have spent 3 decades following money through complex systems tend to develop. A kind of structural patience, the patience of someone who has learned that the truth about money is always in the details, and the details do not lie if you look at enough of them. He had been rattled 3 weeks earlier when Daniel's network had reached out through the mutual contact. He had said so openly, which Emily had respected. But he was here. He had stayed. And what he was walking her through now, in the careful, methodical language of his profession, was a map of something that went considerably deeper than even the documentation presented in court that morning. The offshore structures, Howard said, his eyes moving across something on his screen that Emily couldn't see, are not just about tax shelter. The design is too complex for simple avoidance. The specific routing, the way funds move from the venture structures back into the core company through the intermediary accounts. This is layering. This is textbook layering, which means we're not looking at aggressive tax strategy. We're looking at laundering. Emily was very still. You're certain? I have been certain for 6 weeks, Howard said. I wanted a second opinion before I said it to you directly. I have now had 3. He paused. Emily, the numbers in the federal record this morning are the surface. What I have been building for the past 2 months is the depth. And the depth is considerably more serious than what the court saw today. She absorbed this. How much more serious? Howard looked at her through the screen. The kind of serious that doesn't end in civil restructuring. The kind that ends in criminal charges. The room was very quiet. Does Reyes know? She asked. Reyes has had a version of this for the past 3 weeks, Howard said. A preliminary version. What I'm describing to you now goes further than what he has. I need to get this to him today. He paused again. I wanted to tell you first. Emily thought about Daniel in that conference room, 6 months ago, laughing. She thought about the word nothing. She thought about the specific, deliberate contempt of a man so convinced of his own invulnerability that he had not bothered to be afraid of the woman he was discarding. She thought about 12 years. She thought about what it feels like to build something real and watch someone else put their name on it and walk it out the door. She thought about all of it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "Get it to Reyes this afternoon, Howard. All of it." At 3:30, the thing Emily had been half expecting since the morning happened. She was back at her apartment, at her standing desk, when her phone rang with a number she recognized immediately as belonging to Marcus Webb's office. She looked at it for 2 rings, then she answered it. "Emily?" It was Daniel's voice, not Marcus Webb's. Daniel himself, calling from his lawyer's office line, which told her several things simultaneously, about the state of his composure and the advice he was or wasn't taking. "We need to talk." She said nothing. She waited. "What happened this morning? I understand what you think this is. I understand you think you've built something that changes things. But there are ways to handle this that are better for everyone involved. There are outcomes here that don't require the level of public damage that this is going to." "Daniel," she said. He stopped. "Don't call me again," she said. "Anything you need to communicate goes through your legal team to Susan Doyle. That's the process. Follow it." "Emily, listen to me. I'm going to hang up now. If you do this, you are going to destroy everything, not just me, the company, hundreds of employees, people whose livelihoods depend on—" "Daniel." Her voice had not changed in tone or volume. It was still completely level, completely controlled. "You built your company on stolen work. You laundered money through its structures. You intimidated the people who built it into silence. You told me, in a conference room full of lawyers, that I had built nothing." She paused. "I didn't destroy anything. I'm just making sure the record reflects who did." The line was silent for 4 seconds. Then Daniel's voice came back, and it was different now. The performance had dropped. The control had dropped. What was underneath it was raw and unguarded, and Emily recognized with something that was not quite pity, but was adjacent to it, genuinely afraid. "Emily, please." She hung up. She set the phone on the desk. She sat with the silence of her small apartment for a long moment. She thought about the man who had just said please on the phone. She thought about what it had taken to get him to that word. She thought about whether she felt anything about it. She felt something. She couldn't name it precisely. Not satisfaction. Not cruelty. Something more like the complicated adult acknowledgement that getting what is right does not always feel the way you imagined it would. That justice and closure are not the same thing. That a person can do the right thing completely and still carry some weight from it that doesn't simply disappear when the legal process reaches its conclusions. She thought her father would have understood that. She stood up from the desk and went to the kitchen and filled a glass of water and drank it slowly. And she thought about what Howard Chen had said. Criminal charges, the kind of serious that doesn't end in civil restructuring. 12 years she had been in that man's orbit. 12 years of building something real and being told it was supplementary. 12 years of watching and listening and slowly understanding that the man she had trusted was not the man she had believed in. And now the full weight of what he had built, and the full weight of what he had destroyed to build it, was moving through a legal system that was considerably less susceptible to his particular capabilities than any system he had navigated before. She had not done this for revenge. She had examined that question carefully and honestly, and the answer was no, this was not revenge. Revenge required a desire for suffering. What Emily wanted was not his suffering. What Emily wanted was the record corrected, the credit returned, the people who had been silenced given back their voices, the work she had genuinely contributed acknowledged as the contribution it actually was. Whatever happened to Daniel Carter beyond that was the consequence of what Daniel Carter had done. Not what she had done to him, what he had done to himself, and to others, and to the truth, for a very long time. At 5:47, Susan Doyle sent a message that read, "Reyes has Howard's full report." He called it, in his exact words, "a complete and fully substantiated basis for criminal referral. Moving to next stage tonight. Be available tomorrow morning." Emily read it 3 times. Then she set the phone down and looked out the window of her small apartment at the parking lot and the ordinary evening light. And she thought about a version of herself from 6 months ago, sitting on the concrete floor of a storage unit, opening a folder, allowing herself the smallest and quietest smile. She had known, even then. She had not known the exact shape of it. She had not known every person who would be part of it, or every development that would move the story forward. But she had known the foundation was solid. She had known the truth was complete. She had known that what she was carrying was real and durable, and that real, durable things do not stay buried indefinitely. They surface. They always surface. The only question is whether there is someone patient enough and careful enough and willing enough to do the slow, unglamorous work of helping them to the surface in the right way, at the right time, in front of the right eyes. She had been that person. She had always been that person. Daniel Carter had laughed at her in a conference room and told her she was nothing, and he had believed it, which was the most extraordinary thing about all of it. He had genuinely believed it. He had looked at 12 years of partnership and shared building and real contribution, and he had seen nothing that concerned him. He had seen a woman signing papers. He had seen the end of a problem. He had not seen what she was building in his silence. He had never seen her at all. And that, Emily Carter understood now, had been his real mistake. Not the fraud, not the money laundering, not the stolen patents or the silenced engineers. Those had been crimes, and they were going to be treated as crimes, and the process was going to be long and consequential and real. But the original mistake, the one that made all the rest of it possible, the one that had put her in this apartment and him in a federal crosshair, was the moment Daniel Carter had looked at the woman across from him and decided, without question, without doubt, without a single moment of genuine consideration, that she was not worth being afraid of. That was the mistake that cost him everything. Her phone lit up again. Victor this time. A text, short and characteristic. Board called an emergency session tonight. 3 members have already retained independent counsel. It's moving faster than projected. Emily read it. She put the phone face down on the desk. She sat very still in the evening quiet of her small apartment. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with a window looking out onto a parking lot. And she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in 6 months of forward motion and controlled intensity and carefully managed distance from anything that wasn't the next necessary step. She felt, for the first time, like it was going to be all right. Not perfect, not without cost, not without the long and complicated aftermath that was still ahead of her. But all right in the fundamental, structural sense of the word. The sense that means the truth is in the right hands, and the record is being corrected, and the people who deserved credit are going to get it, and the people who deserved consequences are in the process of receiving them. All right in the sense that means you did the right thing, and the right thing held. She breathed. Outside, the Dallas evening settled into dark, and somewhere across the city, in the 7,000-square-foot house that had once been half hers and now felt, by every account she was receiving, like the walls were closing in. Daniel Carter sat with his lawyers and his PR team and the wreckage of the story he had told about himself for 12 years and tried to figure out what to do next. Emily Carter already knew what she was going to do next. She was going to sleep, and tomorrow she was going to go back to work. She slept for 6 hours, which was more than she had slept in a single stretch in the past 3 weeks. And when she woke at 5:40 the following morning, the first thing she felt was not anxiety. It was something she had almost forgotten the texture of, something clean and forward-facing, like the specific quality of air before a day that is going to matter. She lay in the dark of her small bedroom for exactly 2 minutes. Then she got up. Susan called at 6:15. Reyes filed the criminal referral at 11:50 last night. Department of Justice received it at midnight. It is now formally a federal criminal investigation, not just a financial review. A pause that contained more weight than most silences. Emily, this is no longer civil proceedings. This is criminal. Emily was standing at her kitchen counter with her coffee. She set the cup down. How is Reyes describing the scope? Wire fraud, money laundering, securities fraud, theft of intellectual property with intent to profit. He said, and I'm reading this directly, that the documentation provided by the private party in this matter represents one of the most thoroughly substantiated criminal referrals his division has processed in the past decade. Another pause. He said a decade, Emily. Emily picked up her coffee again. She needed something to do with her hands. What's Daniel doing? Marcus Webb formally requested an emergency meeting with Reyes's team at 7 this morning. Reyes declined. Webb then filed a motion to suppress the supplementary documentation on procedural grounds. It was reviewed and denied by 6:45. Susan's voice moved faster now, the way it did when she was delivering information she had already processed and organized, and was now simply transferring with precision. The procedural angle was always going to fail. The documentation was filed correctly. Everything was filed correctly. There is no procedural vulnerability. They know that. The suppression motion was theater. It was for Daniel, not for the court. He's panicking, Emily said. He's been panicking since yesterday morning, when he saw Victor walk through that door, Susan said. This is just what panic looks like when it has expensive lawyers managing it. By 7:30, the story had broken fully. Not a brief financial segment on a cable network. The full story, with enough detail to indicate that at least one source close to the federal proceedings had decided that managed transparency was preferable to whatever narrative Daniel's communications team was still attempting to construct. Claire Whitmore's piece ran at 7:42, and it was, as Emily had known it would be, the definitive account. Not because it was sensational, because it was exact. Because Claire had spent months building toward this independently and had the context and the sourcing to tell the story in the specific way that made it permanent. The kind of journalism that becomes the record, that other accounts reference, that shapes how history remembers an event. Emily read it once, quickly, at her standing desk. Then she called Claire Whitmore. It's exactly right, she said, when Claire answered. Every word of it. Claire was quiet for a second. I've been working this story for 8 months, she said. I had 2 sources threaten to withdraw on me. I had one source go completely dark after a call from Carter's legal team. I almost killed it twice. A brief pause. I want you to know, I almost killed it. I know, Emily said. I'm glad you didn't. Can I ask you something off record? You can ask. When you signed those papers in March, when you walked out of that building with nothing, were you afraid? Emily thought about the question honestly, the way she always tried to think about questions that deserved real answers. She thought about the elevator, and the lobby, and the sidewalk, and the March sky. She thought about the drive to the storage unit, and the concrete floor, and the files laid out in front of her, and the weight of what she was carrying alone. "Yes," she said. "I was afraid every single day. Fear and stopped are not the same thing. I've learned that's one of the most important distinctions a person can make." Claire said quietly, "That's going on the record." "I know," Emily said. "That's why I said it." The first board resignation came at 8:09. A man named Gerald Fitzpatrick, who had been on the Carter Technologies board for 7 years, and whose name appeared in Howard Chen's financial documentation, in proximity to two of the more complex offshore routing structures, not as a direct actor, but as someone whose signature had appeared on documents he may or may not have fully understood at the time. His resignation letter was 3 sentences long and said nothing that was not essentially synonymous with the phrase, "I was not aware of the full picture, and I am leaving before the full picture becomes my problem." Susan sent it to Emily with the note, "First, more coming." 3 more came by noon. By the time the market opened, Carter Technologies stock had been halted pending the formal announcement of the federal investigation. When trading resumed at 11, it dropped 31% in 40 minutes, and then halted again. The number was so large and moved so fast that it briefly made the financial networks interrupt their regular programming. Emily watched none of it. She was on a call with Agent Reyes, who was walking her through the timeline of what the next several weeks would look like from the federal prosecution side, and who spoke in the measured, professionally neutral language of someone who had learned to keep the emotional register out of his professional delivery, and was making a visible and genuine effort to continue doing that, even in circumstances that were, by any measure, exceptional. "The asset freeze is comprehensive as of this morning," Reyes said. "Personal and corporate." His legal team filed an immediate challenge. It was denied. He is not going to be able to move money, transfer ownership, or restructure any corporate asset pending the investigation. A brief pause. "Miss Carter, I want to be clear with you about something. The patent question, the IP reversal. That is a separate civil track from the criminal proceedings. The criminal case moves on its own timeline. The IP restoration is going to require its own legal process, and that process takes time. Months. Possibly longer. I don't want you to have an expectation that tomorrow morning you wake up and a company is handed to you." "I know that," Emily said. "I know you know it," Reyes said. "I'm saying it anyway, because in my experience, the people who have done the most to build a case are often the ones who find the aftermath hardest. Because the building is over, and the waiting is what's left, and waiting is a different skill." Emily thought about that. "What would you suggest?" Reyes was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she understood that she had surprised him slightly, that he had expected her to push back, or deflect, or dismiss the personal dimension of what he was saying, and she hadn't. "I'd suggest," he said carefully, "finding something to build, while the legal process runs its course. Something that isn't waiting." She already knew what that something was. She had known for several months. She just hadn't said it out loud yet, to anyone except Victor, in a conversation that had happened late one evening in Fort Worth, over cold coffee, when they had both been exhausted and were therefore more honest than usual. But she filed Reyes's words away carefully, because they confirmed something she had been circling toward, and confirmation, even from an unexpected direction, has its own kind of value. At 2 in the afternoon, she got the call she had not anticipated. The number was one she recognized. It was not Daniel's number. It was not Marcus Webb's office. It was a number she had not seen on her phone in over a year. And when she saw it, she stood very still for a moment before answering. It was Catherine Brennan, Daniel's mother, a woman who was 73 years old and had been, for the first 7 years of Emily's marriage, one of the warmest and most genuine presences in her life. A woman she had loved, in the uncomplicated way that you love the mother of a person you believe in completely. The relationship had cooled as the marriage deteriorated, not through explicit rupture, but through the slow, painful process of a woman being loyal to her son in ways that required her to look away from things she was probably seeing clearly. Emily answered. "Emily?" Catherine's voice was older than she remembered, quieter. "I'm not calling to ask you to stop. I want to be clear about that. I'm not calling because of Daniel." Emily waited. "I'm calling because I owe you an apology," Catherine said. "I knew, not everything, but I knew more than I let myself admit for a very long time. I saw how he treated you. I saw what he took credit for. And I looked away from it because he was my son, and looking away was easier than what looking clearly would have required me to do." Her voice caught slightly, recovered. "That was wrong. It was wrong, and I am sorry for it, and I wanted to tell you that directly before this goes any further." Emily stood in her small apartment with the phone against her ear, and she felt something she had not expected to feel today, in the midst of all the legal machinery and the stock numbers and the criminal referrals. She felt the specific ache of something human and uncomplicated that the past 12 years had not entirely destroyed. She thought about the Catherine Brennan who had taught her how to make a particular pie crust on a Sunday afternoon in the first year of the marriage. She thought about small, ordinary kindnesses that had been real when they happened, and were still real in the memory regardless of what had come after. "Thank you, Catherine," she said. "That means more than you know." A long silence. Then Catherine said, "Are you all right? Are you actually all right?" Emily thought about the honest answer. "I'm getting there," she said. "I think I'm getting there." The weeks that followed moved in two simultaneous rhythms that Emily learned to live inside of at the same time. The fast, relentless rhythm of the legal and federal process, which generated new developments with a regularity that stopped surprising her, but never stopped requiring her full attention. And the slower, deeper rhythm of everything she was building alongside it. Daniel Carter was formally indicted on federal charges 41 days after the courthouse hearing. 4 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of securities fraud, 1 count of money laundering, and a charge that Reyes had described to Emily in advance, quietly, as the one with the most personal weight: criminal misappropriation of intellectual property. The indictment was unsealed on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon, it was the leading story on every major financial news platform in the country. Marcus Webb released a statement characterizing the charges as politically motivated and legally unsupported. The statement was 4 paragraphs long. Emily read it once and set it aside. She had long since stopped measuring the significance of what Daniel's team said. She measured significance in what the record showed, and the record, as of that Thursday, showed a federal indictment built on documentation so thorough and so corroborated that 3 legal analysts had appeared on separate networks within hours of the unsealing to describe it as unusually strong for a first filing. Howard Chen called that evening. He said 3 words: "We did it." And then, because Howard Chen was a forensic accountant and not given to speeches, he said goodnight and hung up. Trevor Olson sent a text at 9:15. It said, "Just saw the news. 6 years I carried this. Thank you, Emily. Just thank you." She read it and set her phone down and allowed herself, quietly and privately, to feel the weight of what those 2 words meant. Not thank you for the victory. Thank you for making it possible to put something down. Diane Park sent a voice message from her pottery studio in Asheville. She didn't say much. She said she was sitting with a piece of clay in her hands that she hadn't shaped yet, and that for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe without counting the breath. That was all. Emily listened to it twice. The patent reversal came 4 months later. It came not in the dramatic, sudden form that stories sometimes manufacture for their climaxes, but in the form that real legal victories actually arrive. Through a series of procedural steps and judicial rulings and documented findings that accumulated over weeks and culminated in a written decision from the court that ran to 63 pages, and that Emily read in its entirety on a Saturday morning at her standing desk with a second cup of coffee going cold beside her. The language was formal and precise and contained no drama. It stated, in the measured vocabulary of the law, that the original patent filings attributed to Carter Technologies had been fraudulently restructured, that the documentation demonstrated prior authorship, that the attribution was therefore legally invalid, and that the intellectual property in question was to be returned to its rightful owner. Emily Carter, 63 pages, and her name at the end of them. She read that last page twice. Then she put the document down very carefully, the way you put down something you have been waiting a long time to hold. And she sat with it for a moment, and she thought about the conference room and the water glasses shaking, and the word nothing falling across the table toward her, like something designed to land and stay. She thought about everything she had carried in the years before that moment, and the years after it. She thought about the concrete floor of the storage unit, and the small apartment, and the standing desk, and the long, invisible hours of building something that nobody watching could see. She thought about her father. And then she made a phone call to Victor Langford and said, "It's done." And Victor said, "I know. I read the decision this morning." And there was a silence on the line that was not empty. It was full of everything that had happened, and everything it had cost, and everything it had meant. Then Victor said, "What are you going to do with it?" And Emily said, "Exactly what we talked about in Fort Worth." And Victor said, "Good." And that was the end of the phone call. 6 weeks later, Emily Carter stood in front of 43 people in a conference room at a startup incubator in Austin, Texas. She had not issued a press release about the event. She had not announced it on any platform. She had told 43 founders, through a quiet, invitation-only process, that she wanted to talk to them about something. And all 43 had shown up, which told her something she already suspected, that the people who needed what she was about to offer knew they needed it, even if they didn't have language for it yet. She stood at the front of the room, and she looked at them. Young faces mostly, though not all. Faces carrying the specific combination of ambition and vulnerability that belongs to people who are building something real, and have not yet been in the industry long enough to understand all the ways that real things can be taken from them. She recognized something in those faces. She recognized it the way you recognize your own reflection in an unexpected surface. She had been them once. She spoke for 40 minutes. She told them the truth, not a polished version, not a strategic narrative, but the actual truth of what had happened, and what it had taken, and what she had learned from it. She told them about the patents, and the engineers, and the silence, and the 3 years, and the storage unit. She told them about the fear, and how fear and stopped were not the same thing. She told them about the importance of documentation, not as a legal strategy, but as a form of respect for your own work, a refusal to allow what you have built to become invisible simply because someone with more power in the room has decided not to see it. Halfway through, a young woman in the third row put her hand up. She was maybe 26, dark-haired, with the direct, unguarded quality of someone who has not yet learned to make herself small in professional settings, and who Emily hoped, with genuine intensity, would never learn that. "Miss Carter," she said, "when you were in that conference room and he told you that you were nothing, did you believe him? Even for a second?" The room went very quiet. Emily looked at her. She thought about the honest answer again, the way she always tried to do. "For a second," she said, "not because I thought he was right, but because when someone says something to you with that much certainty, for that long, in that many different ways. Some part of you absorbs it. Some part of you has to actively work against it. And I want to be honest with you about that, because I think the story is less useful if I tell you I was never touched by it. She paused. The difference was, I never let that second become a decision. A second is a feeling. A decision is a direction. I chose the direction. The young woman nodded slowly. She wrote something down. After the session, a founder named Marcus came up to her. 29 years old, 3 patents in development, a company valued at $40 million that a larger firm had been making quiet overtures toward, in ways that he described, haltingly, as feeling wrong, but that he couldn't fully articulate why. Emily listened to him for 15 minutes. Then she said, "Document everything, starting today. Not because you expect the worst, because you respect what you've built enough to protect it." She handed him Susan Doyle's card. "Call her. Tell her I sent you." He looked at the card. Then he looked at her. "Why are you doing this? You didn't have to do any of this." Emily thought about that question. She thought about Trevor Olson and Diane Park and Howard Chen and Catherine Brennan's voice on the phone, older and quieter. She thought about 43 people in a room who had shown up because they needed something she had earned the very hard way. "Because someone should have done it for me," she said simply. "And nobody did. So now I do it." The foundation she launched 3 months later was not named after her. She had considered it carefully and decided against it, because the point was not her name on something. The point was the thing itself, a legal and educational resource for independent innovators, funded quietly and run with the same meticulous, unglamorous attention to detail that had built everything else she had ever constructed. It offered documentation support, legal consultation, and direct advocacy for founders and engineers whose intellectual property was at risk. In its first year, it took on 31 cases. It won 24 of them. Claire Whitmore wrote the definitive profile of Emily Carter 8 months after the courthouse hearing. It ran in a national magazine and was read, within the first week of publication, by more people than either of them had anticipated. The headline was not about revenge or triumph or comeback. The headline was a question Emily had said to Claire in one of their later conversations, when the formal business of the exclusive was done, and they were simply 2 women talking honestly. What happens when you give the truth exactly what it needs? Daniel Carter entered a guilty plea on 3 of the 7 federal counts 14 months after his indictment, as part of a negotiated agreement that his legal team described as avoiding the risks of a full trial, and that everyone who had read Howard Chen's documentation understood as the only rational option available to a man facing evidence he could not explain away. He was sentenced to 4 years and ordered to pay restitution that ran into 9 figures. Carter Technologies, restructured and rebranded under new leadership, continued to operate, a fact that some people found complicated, and that Emily found entirely beside the point. She had never wanted the company destroyed. She had wanted the record corrected. She had wanted the people who built real things to receive real credit. Those things had happened. What the company did after that was its own business. On the day Daniel entered his plea, Emily was not in a courtroom. She was in Austin, at the incubator, sitting across from a woman named Rachel Torres, who had 18 months of development work that was in danger of being absorbed into a larger company's portfolio without proper attribution. Emily listened to her for an hour. She asked careful questions. She took careful notes. She told Rachel what she had told Marcus, and what she had told all the others who had come to her, with the specific, quiet urgency of people who understand that something is being taken from them and don't yet know how to stop it. Document everything. Respect your work enough to protect it. Fear and stopped are not the same thing. And never, not for 1 second, Not for one meeting. Not for one conference room where someone with more power and less conscience decides to tell you what you are worth. Never mistake someone else's inability to see you for the truth about what you have built. Rachel Torres wrote it all down. She looked up when she finished. "How long did it take?" she asked. "All of it, start to finish." "How long?" Emily thought about 12 years, and 3 more, and 6 months, and 41 days, and 4 months, and everything that had come after, and was still coming, and would continue coming, in the long and unglamorous work of building something real, in a world that was not always organized to protect real things. The right amount of time, she said. Exactly the right amount of time. She said it without bitterness and without performance, and without the slightly theatrical weight that phrases like that can carry when they are said for effect. She said it the way a person says something they have actually come to believe, in the deep and structural way that only direct experience can produce. Because that was the truth of it, every year of it. Every concrete floor, and early morning, and late night, and frightened witness, and careful document, and moment of doubt, and deliberate choice to continue anyway. Every single piece of it had been exactly what it needed to be, for exactly as long as it needed to be, to produce the only thing Emily Carter had ever actually been building toward. Not the patents, not the money, not the legal victory, or the criminal conviction, or the headline, or the foundation, or the profile in the national magazine. The truth. Just the truth, standing in the light where it could not be dismissed or diminished or laughed away or told it was nothing. That was what she had built. And it had held.